Today we're going to talk about smallpox. This disease has been the bane of mankind for thousands of years. Although not as deadly as the plague, and not as romantic as consumption, smallpox rightfully holds the title of one of the most terrible diseases in the history of mankind. Smallpox spared no one, neither the poor nor the rich and noble. The French king died of smallpox, Louis XV, and the famous Pocahontas. Peter II, Emperor Peter II of Russia, died of smallpox, interrupting the direct male line of the Romanov dynasty. The death from smallpox of 6-year-old Prince Joseph Ferdinand Wittelsbach, heir to the Spanish throne, led to a war for Spanish inheritance. It is not surprising, therefore, that smallpox was the first disease against which mankind invented vaccination. The first disease against which mass vaccination campaigns were conducted. And finally, it was smallpox vaccination that was opposed by the first anti-vaccinators. Half a century ago, in the 1970s, humanity seemed to have conquered smallpox. And now it turns out this is not quite the case. A seemingly long-forgotten disease against which even vaccinations are no longer given is making a comeback. Smallpox has been a companion of mankind since very ancient times. It's caused by a virus from the orthopox virus family, 2 viruses to be exact, variola, major, or black. This is smallpox we know from European history. There is also smallpox, variola minor or alastrum. This disease is characterized by a milder course, and it is predominantly found in African countries. Smallpox is insidious because signs of the disease do not appear until 10 to 12 days after infection. Initially, it looks like a common ailment: fever, loss of strength, vomiting, muscle aches, headaches, and back pain. After 2 to 3 days, the main sign of smallpox appears: a rash that first appears on mucous membranes and then all over the body. Then the rash becomes ulcers that turn into blisters within 1 to 2 days. 8 days after. The worst thing about this disease is that there is no cure for it yet. All the doctors can do is alleviate the symptoms of the disease. In most cases, smallpox goes away on its own, although the risk of dying from it is quite high, up to 30%, depending on care. The smallpox virus can be transmitted by air with tiny droplets of saliva that are carried with the patient's breath, as in influenza, or through direct contact with the sick person and his or her surroundings, i.e., through the body. The virus enters the human body through the mucous membranes of the mouth, nose, and eyes. There is one interesting feature. The common blackpox virus is transmitted only from person to person, and this is not surprising. It's a very young virus that evolved in parallel with humans. According to genetic data, the human smallpox virus emerged about 3,500 years ago. Scientists still have not come to a consensus. Different variants have been suggested: cowpox, camelpox, rodent pox. I think you figured out the pattern. According to modern scientific ideas, the human smallpox virus originated from the smallpox virus of those animals that began to surround him with the transition to civilization. That is, either livestock or mice. So smallpox can be called the first disease of progress. We don't know exactly where smallpox first evolved, but it was definitely someplace in ancient civilizations. The most likely version is ancient Egypt or the Indus Valley, as I said, in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. And then the virus spread along the trade routes throughout the ancient world, evolving, changing, and becoming more and more deadly along the way. Scientists are now convinced that the first smallpox epidemics were relatively harmless. There were boils on the bodies of the sick, usually on the bodies of livestock as well, and they made people feel worse, but there were few fatalities. But soon the virus evolved and learned to kill. According to one version, it was the smallpox epidemic that destroyed the ancient Harab civilization in northern India. Smallpox is also mentioned in the Old Testament, where the sixth execution of the Egyptian sent by God for refusing to let the Jewish people go is described follows. And there was an inflammation with boils upon the people and upon the cattle in all the land of Egypt. In addition to the Bible, we other evidence that the so-called Bronze Age catastrophe was accompanied by smallpox epidemics. For example, poxes have been found on Egyptian mummies, and even pharaohs had the disease. At least traces were found on the mummy of Ramses V, but this was not yet the smallpox we know. According to the smallpox virus has been extinct several times in the course of human history. This happened, if we talk about the ancient world, when the carriers of the virus physically died out. The human population in the region declined to such an extent that the virus could not reproduce further. A similar thing happened in the Indus Valley and the Mediterranean during the Bronze Age collapse, when the population declined several times. After that, the smallpox virus. The human pox disappeared, but the rodent pox was still around and waiting to again. Smallpox returned in the middle of the first millennium BC, again from India, where a new civilization had already emerged in the Ganges Valley. It was the familiar black, a new strain that had once again spread from rodents to humans. Something similar to smallpox sickened the soldiers of Alexander the Great who came to India in 327 BC. At least in sources describe the characteristic boils on the skin. But for a long time, smallpox was a localized Indian scourge. I mean, there is a theory that the Antonine Plague that devastated the Roman Empire in 165 to 180 AD was smallpox. But there is no archaeological evidence of this yet, and Roman historians described the disease in such terms that it is impossible to determine anything from the texts. The world really learned about this scourge in the Middle Ages when traders spread it around the world, on the Great Silk Road. In fact, the word variola, which denotes smallpox, appeared in 570 in the records of Mark, bishop of the town of Avicentum near modern Lausanne. He used this word to designate a disease with high fever and a rash of expulsions which eventually become covered with scabs and fall off. Actually, the word variola itself comes from the word bubble, just like the Russian word smallpox. The etymology in English is more interesting. Smallpox was originally called simply pox there, which has the same meaning. But in the 17th century, Europe was overtaken by a disease with similar symptoms, syphilis. By the way, do you think we should to make a commercial about syphilis? Well, syphilis was called the Great Pox, and smallpox has since been called smallpox. But tar is a strong word, of course. No matter how terrible syphilis was, smallpox was not inferior to it. Medieval European chronicles show that smallpox epidemics periodically covered different countries since the 6th century. The first European remains of people with smallpox in their lifetime date back to around 600. The first to describe smallpox as a disease was the Persian physician and alchemist Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, who lived in 865 to 925. In a typical pattern, the disease lasted from 2 weeks to a month. Its symptoms were fever, severe headaches, nausea, and abundant skin rashes that turned into pustules. However, not everyone was able to cope with the disease. The mortality rate among the sick could reach 75%, and in the lightning, the most dangerous variant of the virus, it could reach 100%. Razi was also the first to point out an interesting regularity that smallpox is more common in children, less common in adults, and more common in children. rarely old people at all. Actually, that is why, when vaccination appeared, children were immunized first of all. In 961, smallpox spread throughout Western Europe and for centuries dominated among epidemic diseases. For example, in 1241 in Iceland, 20,000 out of 70,000 people died of smallpox. It was no better in other parts of Eurasia. Traders spread smallpox from India in all directions, not only to the west. In 734 to 735 in Japan, a smallpox epidemic killed up to a third of the population. In some provinces, people were dying. In some countries, smallpox was considered a punishment of the gods. Even smallpox gods appeared. In India, it was Shitala, a female goddess who throws poison pearls at people. In China, it was Dao Shen. And in Korea, smallpox was believed to be spread by a spirit that was to be called no other than the honored guest of smallpox. In Russia, the first documented mention of smallpox dates back to 1427, when, according to the Nikon Chronicle, the pestilence was great in all Russian towns, all lands, and they died with pimples. The disease spared no one, neither kings nor the poor, taking more and more victims. The 14th, 16th, 18th century was distinguished by a particularly wide spread of smallpox epidemics. It was practically impossible to avoid it. A very rare exception was a person who had no trace of smallpox. The splinters on a person's face became so widespread it was a phenomenon that the French police of the 18th century had a special characteristic not of their presence, but of their absence. Special black dots, a kind of face stickers, to cover imperfections on the face. They were especially used by women. Well, because for them such disfigurement was the most frightening. Unlike the same plague, smallpox never went away and stayed with people forever. The chaos of the plague was much more rapid, but the plague has visited our shores only once or twice within living memory, while smallpox always is present, filling the church squares with corpses, tormenting with constant dread all whom she had not yet smitten, leaving hideous marks on the faces of those whose lives she had spared, so that mothers shuddered as they looked at their children. The death rate from smallpox was more or less constant. In different years it varied by times, but not by an order of magnitude. From 1667 to 1800 in London, 65 out of 1,000 people died of smallpox, i.e. 6%. The lethality among the sick reached 30%. The first recorded smallpox pandemic, when the whole of Europe and the Middle East were sick, dates back to 1614. And in the 17th, 18th centuries, they were regularly repeated. In 1694, Mary II, Queen of England and Scotland, died of smallpox. William III of Arran. In 1711, smallpox caused the death of the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph I. In 1724, 17-year-old King Louis I of Spain was put to death. If you think it only affected Europe, it didn't. At least 2 Chinese emperors died of smallpox in the same years. There weren't a lot of treatment options for OSPD. There is no cure for smallpox even now, but in those pre-scientific times, medics relied on medication. Hippocrates' teaching about the 4 fluids in the human body, which led to strange, in our opinion, theories. Ar-Razi believed that smallpox was a process of ridding the body of excess moisture. This does not correspond to the real picture of the disease at all. Based on theories like these, in Europe for almost 200 years they used the following recommendations 17th century English physician Thomas Sydenham, who advised procedures such as bloodletting, inducing vomiting, and using enemas to keep the blood inflammation within proper levels. But it didn't help much. Rather, such treatments made people more likely to die. It was such methods that led to the emergence and popularity of homeopathy in Europe, but more on that later. Another medieval idea, quarantine, was much more effective. It is believed that, again, it was Al-Razi who first urged people to keep away from smallpox patients in order to prevent the spread of smallpox. From Europe, smallpox spread around the world. After the great geographical discoveries, the planet became a place of free movement, including the virus. It's been particularly difficult. The greats had to deal with the indigenous peoples of America, Australia, and Oceania, where smallpox was brought along with other contagions by European sailors. There were cases when some expeditions sailed to an island in the Pacific Ocean. The greats there quite peacefully communicated with the natives, sailed away. And then the next ship a dozen years later saw a dead island where everyone had died of smallpox. Smallpox was brought to the Americas by the Spanish in the early 16th century. Around 1520, Cortez's conquistadors brought it to Mexico. Around 1524, again with the conquistadors, it made its way to South America, and in 1617 with British colonists to North America. In 1789, smallpox was brought by the British to Australia. In the Americas, it ended up being the ultimate disaster. Smallpox, which the Indians had no immunity to, combined with other factors like war and famine, led to the extinction of entire nations. Historians put the number of victims of the epidemic in Mexico alone up to 3.5 million. Smallpox is often referred to as the first biological weapon in history. A common myth is that Europeans and Americans purposely sold blankets and things of the sick to the Indian smallpox to cause an epidemic. Well, let's deal with this episode. There are 2 documented instances in U.S. history of Indians being sold contaminated blankets. The first happened in 1763. At that time, the Pontiac Rebellion was underway, when the Great Lakes tribes were opposing the British. They laid siege to Fort Pitt, present-day Pittsburgh, and General John Amherst, commandant of the fort, decided to get tricky. During the peace talks, he presented 2 blankets and a handkerchief belonging to smallpox patients from the hospital as gifts to the Delaware tribal chiefs who were besieging Pitt. At the same time, another British commander, Colonel Bouquet, attempted to plant an infected blanket on the Indians. As Amherst wrote in one of his letters to Bouquet, "Everything possible must be done to infect the Indians by means of blankets, as well as the following use any other method to eradicate this abominable race." There was indeed an epidemic among the Pontiac Indians, which weakened them greatly and affected the outcome of the war. But specifically in the case of the siege of Fort Pitt, this biological weapon did not help much. The Indians lifted the siege, but after the British Army came to the aid of the besieged, not because of the epidemic. The second case dates back to the time of the United States. In 1837, the American steamship St. Peter arrived at Fort Clark on the Missouri River in present-day North Dakota. Sometime after its departure, a tribe of Mandan Indians who lived near Fort Clark came to visit the ship, began a smallpox epidemic that later spread to all the Great Plains. Up to 400,000 Indians by maximum estimates died. The causes of the epidemic were not fully or unknown. There's a theory that the epidemic was triggered by the Indians being sold smallpox-infected blankets from U.S. Army hospitals. But the problem is, Fort Clark was not a military base. It was a private post, and the nearest U.S. Army garrison was several hundred kilometers away. There were indeed 2 agents sailing on the St. Peter, that is, an official U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs. And there were indeed smallpox patients on board. And, most in addition, the epidemic in the Mandan tribe is indeed somehow connected with the arrival of the steamship. But what exactly caused it to start, historians are still arguing about that. I mean, there is information that a blanket of a smallpox patient was really stolen from the ship or sold to the Indians. On the other hand, the passengers of the steamboat, in principle, visited Indian. The settlements were in contact with the Mandans, and it was possible to get infected that way. So we have two cases, one of which can be characterized as momentary. The second questioned whether the Indians were deliberately infected at all. But in any case, even if there was no conscious spread of the contagion, it had a great impact on the fate of the Indian peoples. In North America, smallpox preceded European colonization. Often, when pale-faced people came to Indian lands, they were met only by the pitiful remnants of once great nations. Well, not much in the way of resistance. Even in the Middle Ages, physicians noticed that in the A smallpox, survivor has lifelong immunity. As early as the 15th century in Germany, there was a saying, "Every person should have smallpox once in his life." That's mean. Once you've had it, you can't get infected. And sooner or later, that observation should have led to the idea of infecting people with smallpox specifically to develop immunity. Yes, it was smallpox, a disease that cannot be cured but can be avoided, that led mankind to the concept of vaccination. At first, however, it was not vaccination, but inoculation. Person-to-person transmission of smallpox. This method was based on the observation that if a small dose of smallpox is introduced, the sick person will get smallpox more easily and develop immunity. That is, if a healthy person is infected in a controlled manner from a sick person who has smallpox easily, then the infected person will also have in time and not get sick again. The observation is so simple that it was thought of as far back as the Middle Ages. We do not know exactly where it was first invented to take the liquid from the sores of smallpox patients and apply it to the wounds of healthy people. It may have happened in India, a region where smallpox most likely originated and was a frequent visitor from ancient times. At least the sources mention a procedure that the Hindus called tiki. In Indian texts, it is described as follows. Take with a surgical knife the pox material from the arm of an already infected person. Between the elbow and shoulder, make a puncture on the arm of another person until it bleeds, and when the pus enters with the blood inside the body, a fever is found. In the 16th century, this practice became a widespread public health measure all along the Silk Road and in African countries. In ancient times, there were known different ways of injecting smallpox venom under the skin. The pus was passed through the skin with a needle and left there for 3 days. A fly of a type of therapeutic patch was applied, the resulting blister was cut off, and the surface was covered with dried smallpox pus, incisions were made, and the poison was injected under the skin with a hollow needle. It was common for African peoples to apply a cloth soaked in pus to a wound. China in the 15th century had its own famous inoculation procedure. Chinese physicians took from the cadaveric connection of the sick, pounded them into powder, and then through a silver tube blew into the nose healthy. The effect was the dot. The person got over the disease and got a stable immunity. In China, they even thought of compulsory vaccination of doctors so that they would not get sick and could work with spinal patients. By the way, it is possible that the Mongols brought this Chinese method into Russia. At least, in the 18th century, in the villages of Kazan province, the method was very similar. They grinded smallpox scabs into powder, inhaled it, and then steamed in a bathhouse. Inoculation came to Europe through the Ottoman Empire. In Turkey, the method was applied by applying liquid to the wound, or perhaps by borrowing it from African slaves. In Constantinople, the inhabitants began to be inoculated in this way from 1701. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, wife of the British ambassador in Constantinople in 1716 to 1718, was surprised to write home that the entire harem of Turkish sultans had to undergo this procedure. Here, the purpose was too aesthetic. Concubines with immunity about Cosby did not have the facial marks that so disfigured European women. Mary Montagu convinced King George I to do something similar in Britain. In 1717, the king ordered an experiment on 6 men, sentenced to death in the gallows of Newgate Prison, and inoculated them with smallpox. All 6 survived and were released. King George then realized that inoculation worked and ordered his parents to be inoculated. After that, smallpox inoculation became more and more frequent in England. In 1747, St. Pancratius Hospital was even opened in London, where those who wished could be. In the middle of the 18th century, they had already learned to select suitable cases of mild smallpox. The problem with inoculation was that when inoculating smallpox from person to person, there was always a chance of making a mistake and inoculating from the wrong person. Consequently, there was a risk that the disease will progress like a normal infection. That is, severe ulcers and risk of death. Yes, the mortality rate of the inoculated was still incomparably lower than that of ordinary patients. In the first 8 years in England, smallpox was inoculated in 845 people, of whom 17 died. Inoculation gave a 2% mortality rate, whereas in common smallpox it was, as I said, 30% or higher. But there was still a risk. In addition, it turned out that doctors deliberately infected healthy people who might not have gotten sick. And regularly there were people who died as a result of such inoculations. In England in the 18th century, more than 25,000 people died as a result of smallpox vaccination. Doctors who inoculated people were even accused of being responsible that they spread disease and thus cause epidemics. For example, Zabdiel Boylston, a physician, lived in the early 18th century in Boston, which was then part of the British colony of Massachusetts. He saw African slaves inoculating each other with smallpox using a rag soaked in pus, and decided to do something similar with his fellow countrymen. New strain of smallpox has taken the place of an extinct strain, the monkeypox. Monkeypox has been known to scientists for quite some time. It was discovered just in the process of eradicating blackpox in Africa in the 1970s. The symptoms of monkeypox are basically the same as those of ordinary smallpox, except that its course is easier under normal conditions. In natural conditions, smallpox affects monkeys, but also, of course, rodents. Diseases have been confirmed in squirrels, dormice, and Gambian rats. Actually, as with smallpox, it is believed that rodents are a natural reservoir for the smallpox virus monkeys. At least the first case of monkeypox on another continent, an outbreak in the US in 2003, was linked specifically to Gambian rats sold in the US at the pet store, along with the local rodents. The virus jumped from the rats to the meadow dogs. They were sold to people as DOT. In the end, 70 people were infected. People could also spread the disease. In 2018 to 19, there were cases when migrants from Nigeria brought smallpox in monkeys to Israel, the UK, and Singapore. And in May this year, cases of smallpox infections from Europe and North America began to be reported. So far, the US has the most infected with 18,800 people, and in Europe, Spain has 6,543 people. In the UK, Germany, and France, 3,000 each have been infected. In Russia, so far 2 cases have been reported. The reasons for what happened are not yet clear. Nor is it clear what to do next and how serious the consequences will be. But for now, It looks as if it is being decided right now whether HPAI will return to our world and become a global problem again, or whether a new pandemic can be controlled. But one thing is certain: we were wrong to think that dangerous diseases had been eradicated once and for all, and that we could therefore relax and refuse to vaccinate, for example. Viruses are a thing resilient. They always come back. Apparently, mankind must never let its guard down. Unless, of course, it wants to go extinct.